Hi there, everybody. This is Kumar Garg. I'm a managing director and head of partnerships at Schmidt Futures, and it's wonderful to have all of you join us for this panel conversation on the role that partnerships can play in driving advances in both ML and the applications of ML towards education. And we've got a great panel of folks who are active in this space, and I think it's a great follow-on to our morning speaker around the role that the National Science Foundation is doing in investing in this space. So I think the goal, we're gonna have this for about 60 minutes, but our goal really is to give you a quick run through of how much the ML for education space has developed over the past couple of years, what some of the leading players who are using these techniques and developing a lot of data might be doing, and what might be ways that you might be able to get involved, whether you're a researcher or new to the field, in being able to drive both advances on the ML side and actually apply them in really powerful ways in education. So I'm excited for this conversation. You know, Schmidt Futures as an organization is pretty new. We just hit our 3-year mark. We invest at the intersection of computer science and the public good. And we've been really excited about education as a domain area, given its the maturity of the field and some of the exciting possibilities ahead. So I'm excited for this conversation. So why don't we do a quick round of introductions just to sort of meet our panelists, and then we can dive into the conversation. So why don't we first start with Steve Ritter. Steve, you want to tell us a little bit about you and a little bit about your background and what folks should know about the work that you're doing so far?
Sure. I'm Steve Ritter. I'm founder and chief scientist at Carnegie Learning. We're an education company that's best known for our mathematics products, particularly in middle and high school mathematics. And our primary business is in delivering core curriculum. So we're replacing kind of traditional textbooks with a blended model that includes text materials and AI-based software that we call Mathia that personalizes learning for each student. My background's in cognitive psychology, and we take very seriously the idea that we want to know more about how students learn and apply what we know about how students learn to be able to create learning experiences that are effective for every student.
That's great. Well, next, why don't we go to Heejae? Do you want to talk a little bit about your background and talking points?
Yeah, absolutely. Great to be here, and thank you everyone for listening to the panel. My name is Heejae Lim, and I'm the founder and CEO of TalkingPoints. And TalkingPoints is an education technology nonprofit, and our mission is to unlock the potential of families in being more engaged in their children's education, especially in underserved multilingual communities. There's a lot of them in the US. And we build a product that allows for families and teachers, school administrators, district administrators to communicate with families in their own languages using two-way human and AI-enabled translation, as well as personalized supports that we give in terms of content and training to schools and families. COVID-19 has just really seen a huge demand for family engagement and communication tools this year. So learning a lot throughout this period. My personal background is in the social sector. I was a management consultant, mainly in kind of data-driven decision-making practices and education systems, as well as foundations and philanthropy as well. So great to be here.
Awesome. Well, why don't we go to Jeremy next? Jeremy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Jeremy Rochelle. I'm going to start by talking about a center that I run called the Center for Integrative Research in Computer and Learning Sciences. It's funded by the National Science Foundation, so thanks to the National Science Foundation. And our mission really is to bring together separately funded projects. We don't fund them, but once they're funded, to bring them together because they're exploring the frontiers. They're exploring technologies that are going to be important 5 to 10 years from now. And in doing so, they're bringing together 3 things: cutting edge computer science, cutting edge machine learning. They're bringing together learning sciences theories that really inform how that learning is taking place. And the third thing is that they're really looking hard at fairness, equity, ethics, and those concerns. And so we have a role in organizing that community. for the National Science Foundation and really hosting dynamic conversations. And so, I'd welcome you to participate in that. It's open. And then I just want to briefly mention Digital Promise, which is my employer. Digital Promise is a nonprofit organization that works at the intersections. We're connecting large networks of schools that want to be innovative, that want to be at the cutting edge and address hard challenges together. We also work with developers who are building new products, and then we work with researchers, and we're trying to make for a strong conversation across those sectors. Digital Promise premier thing is the League of Innovative Schools. It has 115 districts across the nation. Those districts serve close to 4 million students. So we have really a large reach, and both in terms of action and in terms of communication. And so it's really an exciting place to work. And if you're going to be active in this area, it's a great place to get to know.
Awesome. Well, why don't we start with just like a little bit of the lay of the land, because I feel like if somebody asked a question, well, how much is ML already being used in education? I feel like sometimes the examples people use for applied uses, people can roll off a couple of examples in healthcare, whether it's diagnostics. There's, obviously a bunch of work recently around, the use of satellite imagery. But I think, people, even though the field has been developing, people don't have the ready examples of where ML might already be used in the delivery of educational products. I'd be curious if there's either within your own organizations or peer ones, what would be some of the examples you would use of current uses of ML that are happening education? So I feel like, Heejae, why don't we start with you? I mean, I feel like there's a bunch of stuff at least I can think of that you guys are doing, but it'd be good to sort of, if folks could learn a little bit about how you guys are using it.
Yeah, thank you for asking, Kumar. And I can elaborate on how we're using it and how we're planning on using it in the future as well. So we have a couple of clear use cases for machine learning. First of all is our translation. So we augment existing machine translations to be more domain specific. Domain specific meaning specific to the education context. So we have a back-end kind of human translator app that as the conversations are happening, these human translators are actually generating conversational data in the language pairs, which we then use that data to train the machine translation to improve. We've seen pretty significant progress in the core languages that we invest in, which, translation quality is measured in standard measures are this thing called blue scores, which many of you in the audience might be aware of. We've actually skipped levels, which means dramatic increases in quality using that human translation data. Second use case that we have is classifying what is happening on the communication platform between teachers and parents. So to date, we have a data set of more than 80 million conversation sets. About 50% of that is in a language that's not English. So what kind of needs and insights do families and teachers have on the platform? So we used content classification to be able to kind of bring up those insights as well. So for example, when COVID-19 hit in March and April, we were able to see the dramatic, both the increases in volume, but also how the content of the conversation actually changed. Because of the pandemic, we saw, through this analysis, about 40% of our conversations were around not just learning, but basic human needs. So for example, healthcare information, internet access, access to meals, which helped us kind of support our district partners better. Now, what's happening in the future, what we're working on right now is being able to make these dashboards available to the school and district partners that we work with, because they cannot possibly go on and monitor every single conversation that's happening between teacher and family, but at the same time they would love to get a sense of what is happening really on the ground with thousands of staff members who are directly now responsible for enabling virtual learning. And that's practically impossible to do that as one person, but on an aggregate level, we are hoping to provide a lot more insights through that content classification model as well.
Yeah, and that's great. So Steve, when it comes to sort of how Carnegie Learning might be using, obviously you guys have a history in this area, but I'd be curious what in current products and future roadmap, how you guys are using ML right now.
Sure. One of the big things in machine learning and education is predictive analytics. So there are a lot of systems that work at college level, for example, and trying to predict who's going to succeed, who's likely to drop out, and that can drive early interventions. So we're primarily in the K-12 level, but we've been doing the same thing in terms of predicting student outcomes at the end of the course. And the way that gets framed is, being able to predict how well students are going to do on their end of year exams based on the data that they provide us as they're learning every day in math class. So within our model, students will typically use our software 2 days a week as part of their regular math class for the whole school year. So that adds up to about 50 hours worth of data from each student. And that data will include students answering math problems, asking for hints, inputting correct answers, wrong answers, and all that pattern of data. And so what we've worked on is models to learn how that data predicts the student preparation for their end of year tests. Now that's being able to predict the end of year tests is kind of the short-term vision, but the long-term vision is really exciting because it changes the way you think about what those tests are, right? Because of course, if you could predict those end of year tests, then we shouldn't have to give them. And if we don't have to give those end of year tests, we can really break the whole school model, right? If you finished Algebra 1 and it's February and the test is in May, you don't have to wait for that end of year test in May. We know we've already certified your knowledge in algebra, in February, and so let's move on to the next course. And so the long-term play is really thinking about how machine learning changes the way schools are structured. It also changes the kind of tasks that you give, because like I mentioned, we think of a test as being something where you're in a closed, quiet room and each student is working individually and there's no opportunity for asking for help. But what we're really doing is fully integrating instruction and testing. And so, yeah, you can ask for help. That request for help gives us some knowledge about what you knew and didn't know. You weren't able to complete that step of the task without asking for help. So now we know something about you. That's a perfectly valid kind of assessment, but it's very different from the way we traditionally think of assessments. So the potential is to also move assessments to more performance-based activities, where we ask students to do complex tasks where one step may depend on a prior step, right? If you can't complete the prior step, maybe you can ask for a hint, complete that step, and then we can see how well you do on a subsequent step. So it really changes a lot of the things about the nature of assessment in the classroom.
Great. So Jeremy, I know that you all actually put out a report recently that sort of looked at a wave of projects in the sort of ed tech space and kind of uses of AI. And I know some of them you're directly involved in, but what would be sort of some of the examples you would give of, current applications of ML in education that folks may not realize are sort of live models?
It's a terrific question, Kumar. AI and education have a long and intertwined history that my colleagues also know about. I was recently going back to trace that a bit. And you have Marvin Minsky in 1969 writing perceptrons with Seymour Papert. And so you have one of the founders of AI working with one of the most famous learning theorists of all time, Seymour Papert. And so the intertwined history is 50 years old. And people often don't realize that. Basically we've had three dominant applications for a long time: developing intelligent tutoring systems, which Carnegie is also a great example of, grading essays automatically, and then the early warning system, early prediction systems like Steve was talking about. And so those are long-lived applications that there's a lot of knowledge about. But now it's exploding. there are so many and so diverse things happening. So we have a 50-year history, but the next 10 years are going to be so different than the past 50. And that's where really the excitement is in this portfolio of work. We have people, for example, being able to use machine learning to observe what's going on in a preschool classroom and share with the preschool teachers maybe some students they didn't notice based on their body position from vision recognition or from speech patterns or so on. So being a teacher's assistant that calls out complex social behavior. We have people working on social robotics where young children interact with a machine that they feel as a partner, and it really advances their learning forward. We have a lot going on to make interaction more naturalistic. One of the apps that's out there these days, you can take a picture of any math problem and it'll help you find an explanation of how to approach that math problem just looking at the picture. So the combinations of vision recognition with some of the capabilities we have and theories we have, I really want to emphasize how important it is to connect theory. Just giving kids the answer to a math problem is not going to help anyone learn. But from the learning sciences side, we know about things like the self-explanation effect, where if a student is prompted to explain a worked problem to themselves, their learning goes up dramatically. And so if we can combine that kind of thing of snap a picture of a math problem, get some explanation of it with the correct prompting to get kids to self-explain and study the solution, we could really see huge gains. The title of our report, if you want to look for more, is called Ambitious Mashups. And so you can search for that easily. It's at the Circle Center. And not only is it a report, but it indexes the portfolio of funded projects that the National Science Foundation has already invested in. So by going there, you can see many more examples than what I talked about and get a real feel for how exciting the landscape is right now and why. I want to write an essay about why now is the best time ever for computer scientists to get engaged in learning.
That's great. Well, I think one area I would love to sort of dig deeper on is this question, like, obviously most ML methods are pretty data hungry, and I think a lot of folks in the research space are, they want to go to places where they have real amounts of data that they can leverage. And I'd be curious, I feel like sometimes people do or don't know whether those applications exist in education, right, compared to other areas. I'd be curious, like, I think you guys intimated at this in a little bit in your work, but I'd be curious on, like, for Heejae, like, I feel like what has been your user growth just this year? What might be, like, if you were trying to talk to somebody on the ML side and said, here's the data that we have sitting in our system that you could actually potentially work with, what would be some of the things that you would want to talk about?
Yeah, what an exciting question. I've been waiting for this, Kumar. So in March, we were reaching 500,000 families in the US. And again, they're really skewed towards underserved demographics, student demographics. So about 70% of the students whose families are on the platform are non-white. 70% receive free or reduced lunch. National average is around 50%. About 90% of our schools are Title I eligible, so really skewed towards kind of underserved demographics. And again, 50% of the families don't speak English. So a very kind of niche demographic where conversations are happening on our platform between teachers and parents. And in March, we had about 500,000 families on the platform. By June, that grew to 1.5 million. And in the last couple of months, it doubled again to reach more than 3 million families. And that's just exponentially taking off. And you can imagine trailing that is also the conversational data set. So the kind of information that's being exchanged between families and school systems, and what kind of interactions are happening, what are the conversational terms, what kind of educators are doing this well and really forging a positive relationship in this virtual environment versus not. So, and of course, in addition to that, because we are running a communication platform, there's all sorts of, user data and activity data on the platform in addition to the conversation sets. So what we're really excited about is kind of mining this huge data set that continues to exponentially grow to be able to get insights around best practices around relationship building. Who's doing this well versus not? Who's doing this well versus not? Are there biases in the conversations across student demographic groups or linguistical groups or cultural groups? What does that look like to inform best practices? And then, fast forward, what does that mean in terms of talking point supports to families and educators to be able to either mitigate those biases, recommend certain conversational terms that we know to be building healthy, positive relationships that are so critical during COVID-19 and beyond. So we're really excited about not just the growth of the data sets, but what we can do with it. And the different cuts that you can make in mining that. And yeah, we're really excited to kind of speak to this community because there's a lot of talent out there. We have really interesting data and there's a lot that we can do with it as well.
One thing that just sort of jumps out to me is I think there's a lot of, like the broader applications to testing different modalities around texting and those sort of communications are many, right? So, one of the other, in the health space, we work with an organization that does, kind of messages, text messages to patient populations around medication adherence. And they have the same sort of question, right? What is the tone of the message, frequency, what is the key content, which then leads to patient self-efficacy, patient behavior. Obviously some of that carries over into, what is the right set of behavioral science paired with, the right kind of communication platform. And I think we're early in a bunch of this. And often when people test these ideas, they test these ideas in really small settings, whereas you're testing these conversational terms in really large settings. And so I do think that there's real power in the fact that one could be actually running these experiments and actually building some real insights on top of these platforms. So Steve, I think on Carnegie Learning, I feel like my talking point on you guys is probably dated, but I remember, if you sort of did, this is the number of users you have, this is how much you're collecting on each interaction. What's your headline number for where you guys are on how much data you guys have and what are you doing with it?
Yeah, I should have probably looked that up before the panel. Last year we had about 500,000 students using our platform, and I think we're up about 70% year over year on to this year, largely due to COVID. So we're a platform that students can use online. There's been a lot of demand for online learning. And we also got a state contract in the state of Texas. So every student in the state of Texas can now use our curriculum for free. We're just starting to roll that out, so we haven't really seen the impact of that on the usage data. But I think even more important than the number of students is the depth of the data from each student. Because like I said, because we're a core curriculum and students are using the software for, an hour to an hour and a half per week over the whole school year, we're essentially getting a data point from each student about every 7 to 10 seconds. And what we're trying to do with those data points, like Jeremy was saying, is it's important to know whether students get the right answer at some level, but it's more important to kind of be able to follow the student's thought process. And what's really interesting in education is what you want to focus on. Everybody's different. People think about problem solving. They have different interests. They solve problems in different ways. And in the kind of traditional math class, if you're thinking of a problem in a different way from your teacher, you may or may not get support for following through on your valid mathematical thoughts in this case. And the real kind of goal and the advantage of having big data in education is now you can look at, maybe the 5% of students who are, have really interesting solution patterns, and we can value those solution patterns and support them in a way that a teacher might not be able to see, because the teacher's own personal experience hasn't seen very many students who are kind of thinking of a problem in that way.
I want to build on that a little bit, Steve. If I was I'm not an ML scientist, but if I was, I think the exciting reason to come over to education in search of new, really great challenges to solve are two things: that our data is hierarchical and that it's longitudinal. And so let me just explain those two. Hierarchical, if you're doing recommendations for Amazon as your goal, you can treat people as isolated individuals and be just fine. But in education, we know from data that kids are very strongly part of classrooms, and who they're interacting with as a social cohort matters. Mm-hmm. And then they're part of a school culture. And teachers vary differently. Mm-hmm. And so if you're going to make sense of ML data in education, how are you going to deal with that hierarchy? I think that's a really challenging problem for scientists to work on. And the second thing is, if you're doing Amazon, you make that recommendation, you're done, end of transaction, uninteresting. But nothing in education is transactional in that way. If we're trying to help a student who may be operating in mathematics 1 to 2 years behind their potential, very common, 1 to 2 years behind their potential due to poor environment, poor schooling, poor instruction, you're not going to solve that problem with one recommendation. You've got to think of a trajectory of experiences that you can involve the student in. Not all that are going to be with your computer program. Some are going to be orchestrating the role of teachers and other students and of parents. So that's a real big challenge for what we can do with machine learning, is to really take in the longitudinal nature of our goals. And so if I was a young scientist in this area, I would here's some new terrain where I can make my mark, because there's hard problems. And if I could have a third, it's really in the speech vision recognition, very complex environments, noisy environments. These are not just listening to me talking on a microphone, multiple speakers talking, kid voices, which are difficult, sketchy writing, gesture, just so many hard problems there that could really advance the core of the technology by tackling these on the margins, but really hard corners of these technologies.
Just follow up a little bit on the longitudinal issue. It's an advantage in being able to look at a student's trajectory over time, but it also affects the way you think about what your goals and outcomes are. Because in education, you need to think of short-term learning versus long-term retention. And we know from psychology that there are interventions that will increase short-term performance, but decrease long-term retention, like spaced practice increases long-term retention. And it's just a challenge in thinking about your data, about getting the measures right and getting the outcomes right over time.
Yeah, and there's a really, I'll just mention a conundrum that I've seen in research studies I've done at considerable scale, at a statewide scale, which is that one of the things you might notice is that a kid is struggling with something, and you might figure, well, I need to go back and put a foundation in place that they don't understand. But if you go back too often, you're not covering the material at the grade level, and you're slowing the kids down. Well, the net effect of that can be actually increasing differences. You're not bringing people along, you're spreading them out more and slowing down the kids who are already struggling. So where do we accelerate? And how do you combine noticing that a foundation needs to be rebuilt, with then somehow accelerating to get on grade level? And that's a really tough conundrum that is just throughout our data.
Yeah.
And no one's got a solution yet.
No, I think this is really good. I mean, I think the nice thing about it is that there's both really interesting domain questions that are worth solving, but also that, there's a lot of data and other things to potentially leverage. I guess one thing that I would be curious around, I'd be curious what the panel thinks is where obviously, we were having this conversation a year ago, 4 years ago, 8 years ago. Like the field itself of ML is rapidly developing on both the number of people in it. There's obviously been some, everyone keeps kind of being like, well, when is the field going to have its next hiccup? But like I think it's been on a basically a 7-year tear on a whole bunch of different domain areas. And so that I think opens up a bunch of affordances around methods and everything else. But I'd be curious around whether it's NLP or something else where like there's a bunch of innovation that you guys are really excited about that's happening in the ML side. You're like, someone should take some of that capability and carry it over into education. I'd be curious if there's particular trend lines that you guys are excited about. And Jeremy, why don't we start with you on, are there things you had mentioned a little bit on vision and NLP, but are there things that are trend lines that you would say, hey, someone should, there's real opportunity to do some application?
Yeah, sure. Be happy to talk a little bit about that. I'll just mention too, and I'm sure my colleagues will have other examples in the Circle community that we host for NSF. Multimodal analytics is a really important and tough problem. We need to learn from a combination of maybe eye gaze, speech, gesture detection, as well as what the students might be doing with some kind of computer software that can more easily be instrumented. And so a lot of really, really tough problems in getting multimodal analytics going as a method, but also I think we're going to just see that accelerate really quickly. And the other big trend I think is really important is finding ways to do sensorless detection of things that are really important learning variables. I work with Melina Unkefer and the Executive Function plus Math program. And so executive function, your ability to sort of self-monitor, for example, your own reasoning. We have intrusive tests that we can give kids and take them away from learning in order to figure out what's going on with executive function. But you don't want to test kids to death. So how can we have non-intrusive, non-painful, easy ways that detect these really important educational variables and then would allow us to really adapt the teaching approach to best suit what that kid is going to need. So sensorless multimodal would be the two big ones that I'm thinking of off the top.
Heejae, what are some areas where you guys have been most excited about on sort of the algorithmic innovation side? Where you guys are?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I mean, for us, just on kind of the product development side, it's twofold. Everything NLP, including, all the way from sentiment analysis, because that helps us gauge the strength of positivity and relationship building between two parties, to clustering analysis that helps us understand what's going on the platform, what's the topic of interest, all the way to topic classification, again, kind of illuminating insights around conversations. So NLP related innovations, there's the custom machine translations that I also mentioned that extends then to multimedia, so videos, audio, to be able to translate, get a voice note from, let's say, a Spanish speaking parent who is at limited literacy levels, and then being able to record that, translate it, and transfer it to English speaking educators. So that's one bucket. Another bucket, plus one on what Jeremy just shared around visual and auditory kind of sensory abilities, because that helps parents to be able to assess their children at home without the help of any other kind of education experience or expertise. So we're pretty excited about kind of being able to record and assess in an ML driven way without much human labor involved, because that will help parents better gauge where their students are at as well.
And Steve, obviously, Carnegie Learning has come from a number of advances along the way on, the role of digital tutors, and but I'd be curious if there's certain things that are happening on the tech side, on the algorithmic side, that you guys are like excited that when applied in production on your things could really have an impact.
Yeah. So one of the things I'll emphasize with both what Jeremy talked about with multimodal sensors and Heejae about sentiment analysis is the importance of motivation, understanding affective states for students, not just cognitive. So I mentioned my background is in cognitive psychology, so I always kind of think about thinking first. But education as an environment is certainly, like Jeremy said, like affected by the context, the teacher, the students who are with you in the classroom, what you think about like why you're in math class at all, why you're in school at all. Do you want to, how does this relate to how you see yourself as a person? How does this relate to how you think about your future? And so integrating methods from multiple sources is really interesting to us. One of the things that the kind of buzzword that we're starting to use a little bit is metacognitively aware AI, which is kind of AI that knows what it's able to do and knows what it's not able to do. We have traditionally thought of machine learning as a way to take data and improve the intelligence of our AI system, optimize that. But we started to think about like the system we really want to optimize is the system that includes the teacher and the students, the other students in your classroom and everything, right? And so sometimes maybe the right thing for our AI software to do is to say, you know what, I'm not, like I mentioned before with students thinking about problem solving in a different way, maybe the AI should say, you're taking a different approach that, maybe is, I don't really recognize or know how to help you with. I'm going to call over the teacher. So what you're really doing is optimizing what the teacher can do. And particularly with motivational supports, we're starting to think the wrong thing. I mean, there are lots of motivational things that you can do in the software, but the human connection with a teacher and particularly with a peer or a parent, your family, those are the kind of things that I think, it just expands the range of reactions that you take when you discover that you're in a situation where the student really needs help. You got to think more broadly than what can the software do. Maybe what the software ought to do is say, I need to hand you off to someone else.
Yeah, I'd love to flow with that for just a second as well. I've often throughout my career, I've thought about, do we think of people as simple and computers as really complex and rich and interesting, or the other way around? And, I think in education, it's really important to realize that a lot of the action is with the complexity of people. And that simple technologies can often be tremendously helpful. And so I'm thinking of a small company I do some work with called TeachFX. And they let a teacher place an iPhone down in the classroom, record her classroom audio, and they give some very simple metrics back, almost like a Fitbit. The key metric is how much of the student's talking versus how much are you talking. Very simple to recognize, really. But the amount of change it produces in classrooms is really striking. And there's so many things about teaching and learning we can't get to if the students aren't active, if they're not talking. So getting the teachers to create more talk in their classroom by this simple measure is so important. The next stage for that is not just like how much talk, but teachers have coaches. And that's a really great way to help teachers improve. But it's painful to get the coaches to the classrooms, and then classrooms are really long, and you spend a lot of time sitting and listening. So could technology just find teachable moments, hotspots? You take, an elementary school teacher is teaching for 6 hours. Can you find the 20, 30 minutes worth talking about, or even shorter, and have the coach and teacher do the hard work, but you've made their life so much easier by finding the pieces worth their time to talk about. And there's so many ways to go with that technology, but it's just what Steve said, is how do we get simple, robust technologies that really cause system change in education by activating the other factors?
And I'll just point out one other part of the data that's really, we're just starting to explore it, but you can then, if you recommend that a teacher come in or a peer help a student, you might also be able to collect the data to provide feedback to that teacher or that peer, right? Yeah. So how motivating is it for the teacher's perspective if you're able to tell the teacher, hey, this student was really confused. We called you in and now look where the student is, right? And so, thinking about that feedback not just to the student, but to teachers, parents, peers. I think it's a big area of exploration that we haven't done enough in yet.
So
Yeah.
one idea that might feel like, you know, intuitive to this panel, but I think it's be worth sort of drawing out is, you know, most of the use cases we've been talking about is actually, you know, what you would call like corporate data, which is like, as in it's data that is actually being generated through some platform that has a large number of users. And, you know, I think some education research appropriately tries to recruit individual sets of classrooms, you know, where the N of the research is pretty small, but you're doing deep work. And I guess if you're, you know, if you're sort of watching the panel, I think one question I'd be sort of curious around is like, you know, is this something if enterprising researchers on the ML side are eager to figure out who they should be partnering with, what are problems they should be working on, to what extent are you all open to potentially having them reach out to you? To what extent do you think that there are players in the field who are on the platform side, they're doing educational delivery, that would be wanting to work more with sophisticated ML researchers who might be interested in working with them on both model improvement, but also advancing the ML side. Why don't we start with Heejae, if you have thoughts on like, to what extent, you know, would you want folks reaching out to you and you think this is a productive area for folks who are interested in applying their talents?
I mean, I think there is a very concrete and straightforward answer here, Kumar, which is absolutely yes. You know, the joke internally within Talking Points is that we have too much data and we don't know what to do with it. So that's kind of like where we stand in terms of, you know, the talent, the data science, the machine learning talent that we are able to tap into internally. So the value of external research for us is just really, really high. And again, you know, as Jeremy pointed out, this is the moment. The COVID-19 has really opened up floodgates for research and data-driven research in the way that we've discussed in this panel, because so much of the behaviors have changed so dramatically, and in a way that was unpredictable. So yes, like we would love to partner with data scientists and computer scientists out there who might be interested in education. And I think one more point that, you know, you brought up, Kumar, around, you know, there is this corporate data available, but there is also a wealth of data sets that one can tap into in education in general, student achievement data, or, you know, school funding data sets that's more national, and the two can also merge. So I'm really excited about not just, you know, mining kind of our own corporate and user data, but how do we kind of cross-reference this against the publicly available data sets out there to draw some conclusions, then would kind of push forward both the field of education research, but also our own internal product development. And ultimately, you know, we're all in this together to be able to improve student outcomes. That's why we're all here in this panel doing this work. And I think it'd be a really exciting field and a time to be able to do that.
Yeah, Jeremy, how would you sort of think about this question around when folks are looking to partner? I mean, this idea that there might now be a new generation of platforms that are eager to have ML researchers and others that they might be open to working with.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's prime time. I think one of the things I want to point to is just where you can go get funding, which we started with the National Science Foundation. Let me just come back to that. There's a new program called Research on Emerging Technologies for Teaching and Learning, Ritter. And Ritter is specifically $850,000 for an exploratory partnership. Go think up something amazing. Partner with a learning scientist, partner with somebody who knows about equity issues in the setting you want to help, and go work for a couple of years and see if you can make something happen. And the community that I help run helps do some of that brokering and partnering. So we can help you find the missing pieces. If you're an ML person and need a learning scientist to work with to apply for that program, we can help you directly. make those connections. And I don't know the timing of when this is showing, but there'll be a recorded webinar about that program from the program officers. So that'd be a great way to learn about that, that funding stream. And then I would just emphasize what Heejae said. We hear from so many companies at Digital Prompts exactly what you said, Heejae. I have so much great data and I don't have time. I'm busy running my business. I need someone to come in and help me, but this data is so rich. And we hear that all the time. So the need is fantastic. And I think the enlightenment of companies in terms of where they want to go and what they want to do is really welcoming for this right now. And there's just a lot of companies, a lot of interest. And so, yeah, great time to places like Digital Prompts can definitely help make connections for folks.
So, Jeremy, why don't we just stay on that point for just a second on this idea that there might be, I think, more interest in this on the research funder community, and that there might be new research funds that folks can go after. I mean, I think, there's been the AI institutes that just had their first round, had education as a domain, as one of the listed topics. I think there's going to be another round by the end of the year. I think, certainly we're on the philanthropic side, we have a program in this area. I think it's a growing set of interest, but I'd be curious if you're a researcher or kind of new to the field, but you're looking for, hey, is this an area where I can actually get there might be platforms where you can get the data, and there might be funders, whether it's IES or NSF that you could approach. I'd be curious if you want to just give a little bit more on the funding landscape when it comes to getting your research idea funded.
Absolutely. There's the federal government, first of all, which, is wonderful funding, and the most exploratory foundational work gets funded there. I mentioned NSF, there's multiple programs in NSF, and NSF program officers, you can call one up and say, this is the kind of work I want to do, where should I go? And they'll help direct you. So don't be shy, pick up the phone. U.S. Department of Education has a lot of interest in this area, strongly growing interest. Ed Metz runs the small business program. So if you're looking to partner with a business, Ed has told me that a lot of their new awards have been AI technologies partnered with education companies. So the federal government is pretty rich in opportunity. Philanthropic sector is super active in this. Your foundation, Kumar, Schmidt, is really bringing a lot of data scientists into education. The Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, has talent within their philanthropy and is reaching out to do new work that would be in this area. And there's just many others. So I think the way to get to know that would be to really look at who's getting that funding now and getting to know them, because getting to know these foundations, they say when you know one foundation, you know one foundation. They're all very different. And finally, corporate social responsibility is really worth noting as well. We've talked about small companies. We have a major program at Digital Promise with Verizon. It just won a major social responsibility award. That program gives 5G laptops and coaching exclusively into low-income schools. Google, very active in corporate social responsibility. Too many companies to mention who are just super active on this front. Apple, of course, long history in education. I don't want to leave anyone out, but the list is too long. So there's really three sectors you can go after. The federal, you can do things with small companies, of course, but larger companies, corporate social, and getting to know the philanthropies.
That's great. So Steve, just to sort of on this question of whether wearing your Carnegie Learning hat, would be interested in having more folks from the ML space reaching out to you, and then what are your sort of general charge of this idea of working with platforms and companies as a place where there might be a rich area for partnering?
Yeah, well, I definitely also echo Heejae's comment that we have more data than we know what to do with sometimes. I feel like not only do we not have the time, but we also don't have the imagination that just getting some outside people to look at what you're doing often gives you new perspectives. And so we've been fortunate to participate with a lot of external researchers on various projects. So one of the things we did a number of years ago was an NSF-funded Science of Learning Center called the Pittsburgh Science of Learning Center. That resulted in a resource called Data Shop, which you can Google for, and we've contributed a number of data sets to Data Shop and have had thousands of researchers come and do various modeling tasks there. We're currently also collaborating on an NSF project called the Learner Data Institute with the University of Memphis. And that's really kind of addressing kind of fundamental issues on how we work with educational data, what can we learn from it, how do we advance that. And so working with some of the researchers there, I think has been really, really exciting. That's where some of the kind of work on identifying strategies has been going on, and a lot of the predictive analytics, as well as some of the other areas that we talked about. We've also, it's not quite on the machine learning side, but we've developed a platform called Upgrade, which is a platform for running A/B tests. So you know, when you think of the full cycle of what we want to do, you may have do some machine learning analysis that leads to potential improvement in the instructional model, and you want to test, you know, field test that in real schools. That's also an opportunity to kind of collaborate with us to think about and test whether the models that you're building actually lead to improved outcomes in various ways.
Kumar, I also want to mention the assessment sector as a place that is hiring and has made huge progress. I think something that you know about, Kumar, is we have in the US a national assessment of educational progress, which is given to a sample of kids throughout the country and is used to benchmark, like, how are we doing in math or in reading or in science over long periods of time since the 1970s. But NeurIPS has had contests recently to apply machine learning techniques to the behavioral data. And what's amazing about that is you're operating in the context of this gold standard test that's conducted on a national sample. So the meaningfulness of your conclusions is high, and the challenges and opportunities for your unique contribution to win a contest is there, which has been pretty cool. And so I think there's just, that's another industry, another sector where the key companies, ACT, ETS, super interested in hiring ML people so that they can improve what they can measure and also measure a wider variety of capabilities. A lot of excitement of how can we measure collaborative learning? How can we measure something like metacognition or executive function as kids take a test? How do we know if kids have special needs if the assistive devices embedded in the test are actually helping them or slowing them down? And just really, really hard and fascinating questions. The data context is so rich, though, because NeurIPS is such, it's not an ad hoc data set that just happens to be collected by a corporation. It's an extremely well thought out data set that really means something for our whole country. So there's those opportunities too in that. It's not just the teaching and learning sector, it's the educational measurement sector. It's just ripe for revolution right now.
Awesome. Well, we're you know, approaching the end of our time, so I wanted to have one final round robin, which is just, you know, if somebody has been listening and kind of like, hey, there's a ton here, both hard, interesting questions, lots of data, lots of room to run, and obviously online learning is going through quite the moment with everything going on with COVID. I just would love to get like a quick set of resources, and we'll share them alongside the panel for folks to follow up on how folks can either reach out to you or just generally get more up to speed in the space or resources. You know, I'll throw a few just to start things out. I mean, I think there's a number of dedicated conferences in this area, specifically on AI and education. Jeremy can go into some of their lists, but I always find actually reading the conference proceedings of the conference is really good. You can kind of get a sense of where there's interest and actually dig in deeper. The second is we've actually created a Google group on learning engineering, which is has been growing and has pretty active, and people can both use it as an opportunity to post their interest, learn about what new papers that are coming out, I know Jeremy manages a community in this area, which might be interesting. So it'd be just useful to do a little bit of a run through. Jeremy, why don't we start with you, just on, since you actively manage a community in this area, on just what are ways, resources that people could be used to just get smarter about what's already happening, and open questions.
Yep. And that learning engineering list is fantastic. Great conversations there. So that's a highly recommended one. So our new website is just coming up. So it's a little barren, circles.org. The prior one has a lot of really good information, circlecenter.org. That's the National Science Foundation related community that we help run. I'll just quickly mention a couple key conferences where people convene on this issue. There's a community called Solar, which is the learning analytics community. So if you Google search Solar and type learning analytics as part of your search, you'll find it. There's an area called educational data mining, which has its own conference. There's the International Society for AI and Education. There's another key long-standing conference. Although it's not primarily an AI conference, my home community is the Learning Sciences community, the International Society of the Learning Scientists. Great place to go to find people on the learning side who are really interested in your ML. So those are a couple that come to mind. Let me turn it over to other colleagues.
That's great. Steve, do you want to go next on just places that you would sort of recommend for folks to just sort of check out, get up to speed?
Yeah, in addition to what Jeremy said, the Cognitive Science Society might be another one to look at. Again, more kind of basic psychology focused, but with a lot of applications education sometimes. You can check out the Learner Data Institute data shop that I mentioned before, and also upgrade-platform.org is if you're interested in the A/B testing angle, I'd be happy to talk to you about that as well.
Great. And Heejae, what are, I feel like you guys have been growing so quickly and obviously have been doing a bunch of work and intersecting both on your own path of building out in this area, but what are things that you would sort of recommend that are just good ways to sort of get up to speed, see what's happening, and other things that you would point to folks?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, +1 on what Jeremy and Kumar you mentioned around the learning engineering group. A ton of learnings, conversations, people to get to know on that group. So that's been a huge resource for us. For Talking Points, we are looking to expand our research partnerships and data science team and over the next 6 to 12 months. So our website is talkingpts.org. Or you could email us at research@talkingpoints.org. I would, if you are just dipping your toes into the education kind of industry in general, I would highly recommend just looking at what kind of publicly available data sets are there to get a sense for what does education data even look like from a national database level, and lots of gems to kind of dig into as a starter kit there as well.
So a nice one to build on Heejae's publicly available is the Stanford Educational Data Archive, CEDA, which taps into the National Assessment of Educational Progress that I mentioned. And another lightweight way to get to know what's going on is to read EdSurge. It's a really nice newsletter every Wednesday. Also, checking out what's going on at ASU GSV is the name of a convening that brings the venture community together. And so if you want to get a sense of the amount of capital flowing into this, check out ASU GSV.
That's great. And yeah, I mean, I think, some of these conferences have been around for a little while, like Learning at Scale and others, but I think they've had real growth and just the volume of papers, the kind of depth have really sort of grown. So I would definitely recommend checking a number of these resources out. Well, I think that closes us out. And I want to just sort of thank our wonderful panel for, I think we covered a lot of ground, but also just gave people a sense of the opportunity for folks who are active and working in this field. So I want to thank them for taking the time and sharing with us. And with this, let's conclude our panel. And we've got, the nice thing is over the course of today, we've got a number of these conversations which can allow you to sort of get both a sense of what's possible and what's already happening. So I really recommend you stick around. So thank you.